What we're interested in is how do we work together. So just to let you know, this is being recorded. If there's anyone who doesn't want your face on the screen, obviously you can keep it off. You can change what is the name on your Zoom identity. Never know what that name is, your Zoom account. And then and feel free to either just listen in, or if you want to really be part of the discussion. So what do we have to do? Well, one of the things that we have to do is we have to strengthen the work that is about gender justice, that is about universal human rights, in law and in practice. If you just look at us in the Pacific and you ask which are the countries that still criminalize, we all know that there is still work to do throughout the Pacific, but we also know that there's a major set of work to be done around the world. I think there's around 70 countries where it's still criminalized to be in a same-sex relationship, and varying kinds of laws and policies that discriminate against LGBTQI people in particular, but that also have obviously some repercussions for anyone. And that's maybe the first point that I wanted to do, is if we're going to examine all areas of life, for women, girls, gender non-binary people, as well as men, then the first thing that we have to think about is everyone has a sexual orientation, a gender identity, a gender expression, and they have sex characteristics. So this is not about just LGBTQI rights. Those who are non-heteronormative obviously are the ones who are most pushed aside from mainstream access to laws, and to policies. But it's everyone in the world who has to look more closely and more clearly if we are about liberation on all territories, including this territory of the body where we hold all of our rights, right? So we have to examine all the areas of our life. We have to examine and change those parts of the societal structure and material conditions that harm us. And if we are asking to remove things, then we also have to look for more just and effective ways to live. Human rights has to be core, gender justice has to be core, but so too do things like ecological justice and climate justice. And that means that we have to be explicit and open about talking about patriarchal systems, about talking about the ways that certain bodies in the world, certain people move through the world far more easily, they experience less discrimination than other people, and that we start to act as if it is normal for these things to be part of society, when what we should be doing is saying, we will pay attention to all of the differentiated needs of every human. And that includes looking at things like the collectives of people that are in a nation state. There is a story of a nation state. It's not just this miraculous, wonderful institution. It has histories, and those stories and histories are part of our histories, and our bodies sit within those states, those nation states. And they're different dependent on which nation state we're living in. And what if you're in a state that's disputed? What if you're, for instance, in West Papua, or you are in a state that needs to decolonize? How do you negotiate when you're not even clear on what are the parameters for that particular nation state, or you're being persecuted by another country? All of those things are very, very necessary to talk about. So if we're talking about all areas and all territories, then we really have to think about it from the very granular level, from the smallest, from the most personal and intimate, which is around bodily autonomy and integrity. And it is about sexual and reproductive health and rights. And it is about sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sex characteristics. And it is about gender and human rights. That every time we talk about gender, we should be talking about SOGIESC. That we can't separate it off into a silo and say, oh, that's about LGBTQI people. No, it's not. It's about all of us. It is about LGBTQI movements, about people who are gathering together, and that's what we're doing. Those who are from LGBTQI oriented and led groups are working together with accomplices and allies and many other stakeholders. So we need to look at political and social restructuring. How do families work? How do schools and education centers work? How do all of these institutions in society interact with us as our particular body that we have with a gender, that we have with a particular set of disabilities maybe, that is maybe in a rural and remote area, a maritime area, or an urban informal settlement? Who gets to express themselves, and who experiences oppression over that particular body? That's a very, very important set of questions for everyone, not just for LGBTQI people, even though we may lead the movements of work on this, and we have. So ecological and climate justice, how are you going to experience any of your rights? One of the things that we say is there are no old patriarchal alliances on a dead planet. So what we have to be able to look at is, what is this urgency? How did we get here to such a place where we have, very few years left to keep ourselves in that safe zone? We are already moving out of the Holocene. We're moving towards what's called the Anthropocene. And that's where humans have changed the ecosystem so much that it's not even like it was 200 years ago. We can't even recognize many of the ecosystems. We have 200 species a day that go extinct. So that means we're changing, that's 1,000 times the usual background rate of extinction. Imagine that. So we know that the changes, the dynamic, the loss and damage is all around us. And this is what today is about, is saying all the work that we do in every area is also about ecological and climate and economic justice. So last couple of points, don't mainstream us into an unjust system. That's why we're wary of things like gender mainstreaming, why we're wary of the ideas about feminine, when we talk about empowerment systems, empowerment into what? Empowerment into a system that oppresses us? So we have to ask those questions. And that's about everything from mitigation to adaptation to loss and damage to all of these sets of work. And the last point here is autonomous local social movements matter. They matter because they are often the ones who can push and pull and excavate many of the ideas that people would rather not look at. It's very, very uncomfortable because it is about shifting power. So how do we do that in new ways? So the base of loss and damage is really unjust patterns of patriarchy, of coloniality, of extracting from the environment, and unsustainable development. To address it requires removal and reversal of these systems and building new just ways of being. Audre Lorde, one of our wonderful sisters who's now passed on, said, "Your power is relative, but if you do not learn to use it, it will be used against you and against your children." And we really feel like that for those of us who are interested in work that goes on beyond us. Obviously, we have to think through that systemic shifts because we're in a level of civilizational shifts that we've never been in before as humans. We have the chance to really change the environment, and we're putting our own species at risk of extinction. So we have to keep that hope and but also that gritty reality of where we are right now. So our speakers, we have a wonderful set of speakers. I'm just going to introduce them all at once so that after that they can go straight into their work. The first is Rainbow Pride Foundation. And you all know, I think, about Rainbow Pride, but they can talk, Abdul can talk a little about kind of how Rainbow Pride came into its set of work, and it's linked very much to Pacific Sexual and Gender Diversity Network. So two kind of concurrent sets of work. Bimba, the wonderful Bimba from Kiribati, and one of the things that's very important right now is that there is a drought and a really severe set of water issues in Kiribati, and we have to be real about the fact that that is also about loss and damage, about the changes to our hydraulic system, about the changes to our water systems. The Pacific Islands Feminist Alliance for Climate Justice is this wonderful new set of feminist organizing, and that's held together by many groups, but particularly Shifting the Power Coalition and Sharon Bhagwan-Rolls, who will be speaking with you today. And we end with my colleague from Diva for Equality, who's also working on issues specifically of women defending the commons, and also a really wonderful grassroots feminist network that is now building and doing specifically youth-led work. I have nothing to do with their organizing, and part of that is being very, very systematic about how young women are moving on the issues of intergenerational justice and about climate and ecological justice. So that's Kado. or Vika Nasongakoko. Thank you. And then the two areas that they'll focus on is what actually is the work, because a lot of people don't know what we're all doing around this vast region. What's the work to connect sexual rights, gender and ecological justice and climate justice? Give some examples. Why does it matter? But also, what do we need governments and others in society to do so that gender and sexual rights are recognized and respected in all sets of ecological and climate work? And that's really the end of it. And I'd like to pass over, let me finish this slide. I'll pass over first to Abdul, and we'll go from there. Please keep introducing yourself in the chat. We're really interested in who came along today and why you're interested in being in this room. So please keep the chat going. Thanks very much, Abdul. 5 to 7 minutes. Thank you.
Sure. Are you guys able to see the sharing?
All good.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Bula from Fiji, and happy Pride Month. As I'm speaking here right now, my team in Suva is actually hosting a Pride Fund fundraising, where we are going to be launching the Pride Fund for SOGIESC inclusion for community-based organizing around SOGIESC. And we are also relaunching the Condomizing Hotspot initiative, which is about providing free access to condoms at hotspots where sexual behaviors may lead to health problems, especially STIs. So just a background on that. And also, it's very difficult to follow through after you have Nolin speaking before you and then the set of speakers I have after. So please bear with me as I go through this slide. As Nolin has mentioned, I'm Abdul. I'm the program manager at the Rainbow Pride Foundation. I'm just going to give a brief background on what RPF has been doing and what our recommendations are around climate change, disaster risk reduction, and humanitarian response. After COVID-19, we kind of pivoted the work that we were doing towards these three areas because COVID-19 kind of gave us that platform to realize that we have an opportunity to expand the work because of the needs of the community we serve. So I'll cover that later. So just if I'm able to do this, yes. Okay, just a brief history. We were RPF was formed in 2009, that time as Men's Empowerment Network. Fiji, the first focus was on HIV/AIDS response to men having sex with men and the transgender community. I understand I'm only 1 year old at the Rainbow Pride Foundation, but from the history I've gotten to know in office, 3 times the NGO registration was declined because it did not meet the objectives of the act where NGOs register. So to work around that, we registered as a limited liability company in 2014. The new registration saw a rebranding of Men Fiji into Rainbow Pride Foundation, where the focus changed from men having sex with men and transgender community to people of, well, now we say people of diverse SOGIESC over the board. Our focus areas right now as per our strategic plans are around the LGBT rights and equality, health and well-being, climate change and DRR, and socioeconomic justice. Sorry, if I'm too fast, please do send a message and I'll be able to see. What are we currently doing as an organization in the area of climate action, DRR, and humanitarian response? We are part of the Australian Humanitarian Partnership Consortiums, where we have multiple projects on disaster ready, sustainable livelihood, humanitarian response. We've been part of COVID-19 activation, part of TC Herald activation. We have worked around creating a SOGIESC in CBDRM, SOGIESC in Community-Based Disaster Risk Management manual, where we are working with communities, not only with people of Fijians of diverse SOGIESC, but also with communities where they live in, on how they can create a disaster management system which is inclusive of people of diverse SOGIESC and people of diverse SOGIESC who identify as people with disability. So looking at the intersectionality lens there, looking at language, looking at special accommodations or accommodations in general that people of diverse SOGIESC may require in their multiple identities that they have. We have also partnered with Kaleidoscope Diversity Trust, and this is just something we finished, I think, a month or 2 ago. We are about to launch this, where we have done a policy brief looking at the legislations in Fiji on climate change, DRR and humanitarian response, identifying the gaps that exist around SOGIESC inclusion. And as an add-on, we have created a roadmap of SOGIESC inclusion in those areas that can be used by our partners and allies, and that we would like to socialize with the wider CSO community and hopefully some of the government agencies that we are targeting. We continue to work on SOGIESC sensitization training in communities. We have worked with NDMO. We have worked with the emergency evacuation centers in communities, providing gender sensitization, introducing the concept, doing things like power walk, understanding what SOGIESC is, what is the importance of pronoun, what does this identities mean in evacuation centers. So we have done those kind of trainings all around Fiji. Due to COVID, I think 2 or 3 EOs were left, mostly in Savu, and that's the work that will continue with the next financial year. We have developed the manual, and we have got ongoing humanitarian response with partner organizations around these areas. I'm just going to go next. Sorry, my laptop's really playing up. So I think one of the most important piece of work that we did around disaster risk reduction and all of these issues was the Down by the River report, which was a report that was done right after TC Winston, which noted the experience of the Fijian LGBT community. It was a milestone research, and we got to see lots of stories, and there were lots of recommendations, lots of realities that came out that kind of started guiding our work in the area of disaster risk reduction and humanitarian response. So some key finding, there's still discrimination, marginalization, which undermine attempts and increases vulnerability to shocks and stresses. And therefore, the capacity to build back, to recover is reduced. Things such as vicious cycle that people of diverse SOGIESC face, the bullying and violence at school, decreased literacy rate, meaning the sort of employment that the people of diverse SOGIESC engage in, the kind of salary that they get, all of this reduces capacity to rebuild after natural disasters. The stereotypes where LGBT communities are boxed into certain types of employment. Looking at COVID, we realized when we did our assessment after COVID or during COVID, a lot of the LGBT communities in the Western Division went through a lot of issues because they lost jobs because they were mostly engaged in the tourism industry. We had stories around people having to move back home when they really got out of the home in the first place and got a job in this industry to support themselves and be away from discrimination. And it was a very common story among this development space when this was being discussed. They had to move back into those households because of the boxing that we do of LGBT people and the kind of industries that they can join for employment. Family pressure to undertake domestic and child caring duties rather than seeking training or external employment. Again, the whole patriarchy concept that if you give up your, and I'm saying this in quotes, sorry, my camera's not working. If you give up your masculinity, then the social norms around femininity is put on you. And this is for mostly men or the trans community that we got this from. So low-paying informal jobs, your socioeconomic status is not improving. It's a vicious cycle, less capacity to rebuild and be financially contributing members of the society. Informal jobs means, we also found in the research that because of the sort of employment that sometimes the community engages in, the less pay forces them to enter into sex work voluntarily or out of necessity, and then they face double layers of discrimination based on their gender and or sexual orientation and the kind of work they're engaged in, and then they get further pushed into the community, and they sort of find acceptance within communities that might engage in drug abuse, and they become vulnerable to people who on the streets. Another thing we found was that because governments aren't able to prioritize resources at the evacuation centers during natural disasters, the evacuation centers are not gender responsive. This increases sexual harassment and sexual and gender-based violence in emergency evacuation centers. And one of the things that I found out, and this was recently when we were doing consultations, was people said we would rather stay at our place knowing that we might be in harm's way during natural disasters until the last moment, because we have to prioritize choosing our safety in our safe spaces versus going into evacuation centers and facing the harassment and the trauma of being not recognized by gender or by our orientation needs. So they would rather be in their dwelling till the last moment than seek shelter early on because of the situations created in evacuation centers that do not cater to the different genders. Of course, we have seen with COVID-19 and various natural disasters, the religious and cultural persecutions and ostracization, where the LGBT community continues to be blamed as punishment for their sin. Therefore, God is sending us these disasters. It's going to be very quick. Based on all of those findings, most of it came out in our Down by the River report. Some of it happened this year when we're doing consultation for our policy brief and SOGIESC roadmap. Some of the recommendations that came out was that we need more gender sensitization, capacity building for national disaster management agencies and humanitarian agencies. This includes both government, civil society, development, donor partners, etc. We need to mainstream SOGIESC into different humanitarian clusters. And by saying that, most of the time we talk about saying, oh, there's components of JETC. But with components of JETC, what we have realized, our experience has been that when we talk about gender, it mostly focuses on women, but does not focus on the other genders that exist. So my experience has been that even JETC, being a diversity and social inclusion concept, becomes binary at some point because we're so used to using that word, but not the principle or applying the principle. We need to mainstream the collection of disaggregated data based on sex, gender, and identities for proper humanitarian response. And this is about intersectionality. We have a whole, at the Rainbow Pride Foundation, we have a whole hub, a special interest group called the Disability Pride Hub, made up of people of diverse SOGIESC who identify also as people with disability. Faith-based organizations. So if you look at it, government agencies and maybe CSOs are unable to penetrate all parts of Fiji, but the one institution that is everywhere is religious groups. So we cannot not work with faith-based organizations as organizations that are allies or working for and with people of diverse SOGIESC. We need to build these inroads. And the past 2 years, we've been working with the Fiji Council of Churches on a Building Bridges project, where we have come with a 13-point action plan to actually work with the church groups on how to have SOGIESC mainstreaming. And that is including sensitization of lay pastors and ministers and the humanitarian response during natural disasters. I'll be quick, there's just a few more slides. Oh, sorry, a few more points. As a build on to humanitarian response, we cannot only be thinking about, oh, let's give food packs for the next 3 months. We need to think about gender responsive budgets, which allow for safe evacuation centers. And we need to be thinking further down the lane that if you have lost your livelihood, how do we prioritize and have targeted access to microfinance, training, and employment opportunities for groups of people who have lost their livelihood or jobs. So humanitarian response must not end at food packs and a few months of cash-based assistance. It needs to go beyond. It needs to be about rebuilding, not only for the next 2 months, but for the next next year even, because natural disasters are going to come back again. How do we make our communities resilient? The last one, I think, is that we want donor organizations that are funding DRR and humanitarian programs to mainstream SOGIESC inclusion frameworks into their make it a donor principle. There are organizations who wish to be transformative, but they might not have the capacity. But when donor organizations are able to say, just like they're able to say, oh, it must have an impact on women, when we say it must have JETC over the board, it must have diversity of gender and sexual orientation, organizations will make an effort to become transformative in the work that they do. Sorry, I think I'm going over time. So so to conclude, so SOGIESC inclusion in climate action, DRR and humanitarian response has a long way to go in Fiji and the region. Yes, we are doing a lot of good work. It's taken a lot of time to come here. It will take a little bit more time, but what we need is not only LGBT focused organizations, but our allies to be there when you have the space and we are not in the room, to do that name drop for us that, hey, you want to have SOGIESC inclusion, X organization is working with LGBT people. We might have the technical expertise, we might have the network to help other organizations become SOGIESC inclusive. The process is slow but important. Yes, partners such as donors and development partners could mainstream SOGIESC inclusion in those areas. And SOGIESC sensitization capacities around SOGIESC inclusion must be upscaled and prioritized both by implementers and as well as donor partners. I think that's the end of my presentation. Sorry, I'm a bit out of breath, but I hope it made sense. Thank you.
Made total sense. Thank you very much, and for managing to pack so much into a very complex set of work into a very short presentation. Thanks, Abdul. We're going to pass straight on now to Tebeo Tamton, who's a very long, standing member of the LGBTQI activist community, but also, really a lived expert on issues of climate change and DRR. And humanitarian work. So thank you, Bimba, if I can ask you to speak now. Thank you. Who's got the presentation? I think Joshua, you're playing the presentation. Is that correct? Thanks.
Thank you all, Noemi and Mary from Kiribati to everyone. Happy Pride Month. Okay. First, I would like to acknowledge the work of this group, especially Joshua and Noeline, and what an awesome presentation for the work that has been done. I'm really inspired and motivated to actually do more on climate change. You'll see more of this in my presentation. So thank you, Noeline and Abdul, for such a lovely presentation. Just before we start, before going into presentation, I just want to give just an update on what we're doing with Pride Month here. We're just basically for Bimba, we have 3 main events this month. We have a clean-a-thon at the beginning of the month, a sports day for our members, and tomorrow we're having a market day, which is market day or showcase for some of our members and made products. So yeah, that's it for Pride. I'll move on to the presentation now. Just thank you. So yeah, so Bimba, like as mentioned earlier by Noeline and the rest, is a LGBT network organization based in Kiribati, established in 2016 as a result of the work with our engagement with PSTDN or PTDN back in 2014. We have an office based on Tarawa with the HIV program unit, but we work around Peso and Tarawa mainly, and some selected outer islands. Our focus group of members are Pilipinay. Pilipinay refers to gay boys and men, bisexual boys and men, and transgender girls and women, which are the most prominent members of our network or NGO. And our work has been mostly around advocacy, awareness, and action on LGBT or SOGIESC pride at the moment. So we haven't really done so much on climate change, so it's really good to learn our experts in this area. Yeah. Next slide.
You want us to move the slide? Yep. New slide.
Move the slide. Yes. So yeah, this is basically what I'll present today in terms of what we've done in terms of climate justice. Before we begin, we cannot begin a conversation on climate justice with a deficit mindset relating to the recognition of equal rights for all communities. And there's a need for mainstreaming that has been mentioned earlier to access support mechanisms for climate adaptation, which remains a core focus at the moment for us here in Kiribati. And this is important for inclusivity and visibility, especially for marginalized communities here in Kiribati, especially the members of Bimba. And yeah, so I've highlighted just 5 of the main constraints, which are also opportunities for us. And the first one is limited access to funding. Limited engagement. At the moment, we have not been really engaged with the work on climate change. We need to be at the table with the public and private sectors. We've been invited for a few, but I think we need to be more present at some of these important discussions on climate change to ensure that our concerns part of discussion and included in some of the important documents like policies and any plans in relation to climate change and disaster risk reduction management. And the last two are more like worries for us here in Kiribati, especially our transgender population, in terms of the lack of gender recognition for Pinapinaine. This is one example is the in terms of gender roles. In terms of if there's a disaster or natural disaster, and then there's the need to put people in emergency shelters. One of their main concerns is that they'll be given roles that are, like gender specific roles, like those that usually, those that were, how do you say, like considered norm for men, they'll be given to our trans community. Yeah, and the other one is in terms of segregation. If there's, if policies are made in a sense that there's no recognition of gender or transgender, then obviously transgender could be left with the men the male sectors of the shelters, or maybe with females. But some of our experiences at the moment in Kiribati, not everyone understood the principles of being bisexual. So a lot of women, or maybe our allies, women-led allies, needs more education on how to ensure that transgender are not are separate, or how to say it, are not bisexual necessarily in terms of their gender identity and expression and sexual orientation. And the other one is because we are very marginalized here in Kiribati, we are probably more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, and that means access to resources and services here in Kiribati. At the end of the day, BIMPA is hoping to survive and thrive in an environment that is free from discrimination, stigma, violence, injustice, and of course, natural disasters like climate change, the impacts of climate change, and others. Thank you. Last slide. Okay, so this is the last slide, and it's basically how we're hoping to move forward from this point, or maybe after this webinar. We're hoping to have more dialogue in the form of training, workshops, peer education, data collection, and research that are around climate change and SOGIESC. The second one is in terms of partnership. Public-private partnerships are important for us here, especially when we have when climate change is a big concern, it's a major concern around the board for our public and the public and private sectors. And this means working with some of our allies, existing and emerging allies and partners here in Kiribati. And of course, the third one is networking. I believe networking is very much what we're doing right now, engaging with our regional and global partners, discussing issues on climate change and SOGIESC. And the final one is collaborative work. Well, it's very much related, but for us, this is usually challenging, but essential to ensure that vulnerable people and communities are not left behind when solutions for certain problems, especially climate change related impact, were being designed, developed, and implemented. At the end of the day, some of the intervention in Kiribati and within the region needs to explore problem-driven solutions and consider including marginalized communities like the LGBT communities, people with disabilities, youth, and others. These are quite important to ensure that we have access, to ensure accessibility and availability of resources are protected from the negative impacts of climate change. I'm talking here about lands, water, food crops, fisheries, and of course, like Noeline mentioned, water security. Yeah, like in Kiribati, we're just having this LF3 on drought or the shortage of water. That's the first. I mean, that's the first time I'm experiencing this since 20 years back, I suppose. Yeah. So yeah, and of course, these are also important to ensure that our unique identities and traditions, the sources of our Kiribati pride, and are safeguarded and be able to be passed to the next generation, regardless of diversity in sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. Yep, that's all from me. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Tebeo, and adds to kind of the, looking at something from a national level response and from a small island states perspective, particularly right now when we're faced with so much loss and damage. And thank you for making those connections between climate and disaster response and humanitarian issues. So I think it's something that we do very, very well in this part of the world, and that we're trying really hard to do even better. So thank you. The next person that we'd like to turn to is a real ally of the LGBTQI movement, but also particularly of people with disabilities and women and gender non-binary people with disabilities. So thank you, Sharon. We can hear from you now. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Nolene. And Jesu is going to be running the slides for me, but I just want to start off by saying, and let me just very quickly find what I was going to say, that it's really important for us as the Shifting the Power Coalition to recognize our collective work in tackling the persistent inequalities and discrimination that worsens every time we have a crisis, whether it's a local drought or flood and the bigger national disasters, including the health pandemics such as COVID-19. And these discriminations happen, as you've said, Nolene, because of our gender and as well as our age, location, and ability, and often our inability to access the resources that we need, whether it's for rapid response, emergency grants, or co-funding and advocacy work. So we're proud to be working, including with PICAN and the Gender and Climate Justice Working Group, as well as the Pacific Island Feminist Alliance for Climate Justice, to address the drivers of inequalities with our partners across 6 Pacific Island countries, and now more broadly with the Alliance, not only to bring visibility to the inequalities, but to show how we can enhance accountability to the human rights and peace and security agendas across this huge climate change agenda, whether it's enhancing and sharing how Pacific Island women-led innovation, such as Women, Wet and Weather and Mary Got Information can work, or how disaster risk reduction governance can actually drive accountability or building inclusive climate security, and also demonstrating how feminist funding models can actually put the power into the hands of Pacific Island women to determine where, how, and when resources reach communities to be transformative and to shift the power. And finally, I just want to add, particularly for the work that we all might be doing in multilateral spaces, that it's important to recognize the pushback on accountability and inclusion. So it's no longer enough for us as heteronormative women within this feminist and women's rights space to simply welcome the language of inclusion on women and girls, but to amplify that we must be talking about gender equality and human rights and not further exacerbate exclusion. And finally, as Pacific Island people, we also need to decolonize our thinking as we build on the legacy and diversity of our Pacific forebears in our civil society movement going forward. So if we could please move to the next slide, Joshua. So I'll tell you a little bit about the Shifting the Power Coalition and what we're trying to do as an ally to the movement. So we have a set of partnership principles that are really about collaboration, feminist collaboration, which is about listening and learning. It's about diversity, which can lead to new values and perspectives, equity, openness, mutual benefit, and courage. And as you can see in our illustration, and apologies if you're visually impaired, but it's about the basket, that we put all our gifts into the basket when we work together. And so for us, we're committed to building an inclusive feminist model of partnership and collaboration, which requires listening to the diversity of voices to co-create safe intergenerational spaces, and to use a model where the resources reach the communities. So we'll go to the next slide, please. One of the things that we've been doing in the last few months is really about listening and learning. And so just as we were conceived as the coalition back in 2016, by listening and learning from our partners around the table who came from the peace building, disability rights, young women-led, and humanitarian movements, we also recognized as a coalition that we also needed to understand better the women and feminist climate justice movement. So last November, we undertook a landscape analysis of feminist organizing by civil society organizations, and looking at how activists are responding to the impact of climate change on the lives of women, girls, LGBTQ+ individuals in the Pacific. It really reaffirmed that feminist organizing in our region is diverse, it's vibrant, it's expanding, and that the values of trust, respect, and genuine relationships are core to our partnerships and movements. And that we can build on this to really drive programming, including for climate justice. So let's move to the next slide. So that's why we're really proud of where we are right now in the inception and co-creation phase of the Pacific Island Feminist Alliance for Climate Justice. It's a movement-led approach. It's coming from listening to allies, partners through the survey to celebrate and enhance the visibility of Pacific Island women-led and feminist organizing for climate justice. It's co-creating a space for regional and national learning. It's about collaboration to draw attention to local priorities and to continue to drive that accountability agenda to gender equality and human rights. It's about listening and learning to identify the opportunities for advocacy and engagement. A number of us, for example, last week were in the room together looking at the different aspects of climate mobility. And that was so important because it can't be just about one of us at the table anymore. It's really about this whole concept of redesigning the table to bring our different perspectives into putting the power of decision-making into movement work. So what the movement-led approach is doing through the Alliance is putting the power of decision-making by learning from the committee members and through the narratives that were shared with us into a climate justice fund that we're really proud to say that diverse Pacific Island women will be making the decisions about the grants. So let's go to the next slide. Next slide, please, Jesma. So this is the final one, because we really believe that the future is diverse. It's diverse and it's accessible. So we recognize the work we're doing with the disability rights movement. We recognize the multiple challenges that we all deal with as Pacific Island women. Nolene, when you really broke down, gender identity for all of us, whether we're heteronormative and a feminist Nani G like me, or someone like you, Nolene, who's also a mom, how do we actually work together? So it's about this feminist vision of intersectional, intergenerational, and inclusive decision-making as the way forward, recognizing the diversity of experiences, taking time to really enhance our collective ability to bring about transformative change. So whether that's within the women's rights or feminist movement, broader civil society, working with faith-based allies, as Abdul mentioned earlier, and even engaging through our traditional and indigenous structures. I think this is a really exciting time, and this is a wonderful webinar to be part of because it really is about a new generation of activism. Thanks, Nolene.
Thank you very much. And if there's anyone who wants more information, we've just put in the chat. We're trying to make sure we use the chat as a way to share resources. So I'm sure Sharon and others, I hope I haven't said anything wrong, Sharon. I think it's still open, is it? Am I right? Those small grants for Pacific Island groups. Yep, women-led groups. I can't hear you. Sorry, Sharon. Can't hear.
There you go. The broadcaster in me forgot to put the microphone on. Yes, please continue to share information. And we really want to hear from, particularly from the small island states as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, now we're going to thank you very much, Sharon, and giving us kind of a perspective of how we're really trying to push and change the political will and working together much more effectively as feminists, particularly, but also broader as human rights and women-led local autonomous movements. It's so incredibly important in the work for climate and ecological justice. So we're going to move in that vein to someone who's very close to my heart, which is Kado. You may know her as Kado or as Vika Nasonga Koko from Diva for Equality, but she's also part of many other groups. So maybe you can start by saying what groups you're involved in. Thanks, Kado.
Thank you, Knowles, and good evening to everyone, to the speakers and also the participants that is being listening in and tuning in from wherever you are. Vika Kalo Kado, as normally called by my colleagues and by my close friends, works for Diva for Equality as a management collective member, and also focal point for the Women Defend the Commons Network, and also Fiji Women Builders peer support group. So yes, climate change. Climate change is not a small issue. It is not something that can be swept under the eBay or met. It is a global, regional, national, and a personal issue that we deal with every day. Whether you're rich, poor, white, brown or black, hetero or LGBTQ community member, or from a single-headed household, we are all affected. For example, before here in Fiji, we used to have cyclone seasons from November to April. But now it seems like any time. Even for us at Diva for Equality staff that has been recently moved to the western side, most of our lives we were living in Suva. We are now facing the flooding and also the heavy rainfalls here in the west. Why it matters? Because all people, all women of all diversity are affected. Our bodies and survival are on the line. It's the worst that could happen. Our bodies are being violated in our own homes, evacuation centers, other places of safety. Loss and damage to our homes, our natural resources, food sovereignty, and most of all, the impacts physically, mentally, and psychologically. If you are a woman living with disabilities, women in poverty, women living in the maritime, LGBTQ community members, sex workers, people from the remote and informal settlements, your challenges are double or triple. This shows how we as a state, as CSOs, activists, feminists, as humans, and also human rights defenders invest in the work we do. We at 2022, we still hear the humming of an LGBTQ member. Fiji being the highest rate of violence against women in the world. More women and people living in poverty. Then we need to revisit where we invest our energy, our funding, and the work that we do. How is it that we continue to address human rights if all we care about is profit and power? We should center our conversation for gender and climate. Because how can we continue the good work if the environment around us is breaking down and our villages are relocating? There is no gender justice without climate justice. We need to work together from grassroots level to national, to regional, global level, then down the ladder. We have learned and heard about the Sustainable Development Goals, but there is no drawdown to the community. But when it comes to drawdown to the communities, we cherry pick the communities. What happens to leave no one behind? Diva for Equality continues to address these issues.
Take to get from here to Yarralumla. right now.
I think someone's got their, sorry, I think one of you has got your mic on. We just heard about Yaralamla. Thank you. If I can ask you just to turn it off. Thank you. Thanks, Kado.
Deal for Equality continues to address these issues by working with grassroots women. Women of all diversities are already movers on the ground, in their own communities, in their own households, in the society. We should provide them with spaces, resources, knowledge, and tools so that they are well organized in challenging decision-making processes that they are engaging. They are already doing their work. It just needs affirming and acknowledging the work that they do. And we should recognize and affirming that at national, regional, and global level. We bring them, the direct voices from the ground, into our spaces, in the policy influence spaces, into the women's rights movement. Example, like the National Action Plan to prevent violence against women that's happening right now, and extras. Because women and people with diverse sexuality, and also women living with disabilities, sportswomen, women in poverty, they have lived the reality of climate change. We don't just wake up one day and decide to become activists, because we have lived the reality of it. Deal for Equality started investing in doing biodiversity projects to cater for the loss and damage that we are facing at the moment. Loss and damage to the ecosystem means loss and damage to our livelihood, native plants and species, loss of traditional knowledge, and loss of our natural resources, which sums up of who we are as custodians of the land. We must invest in maintaining and sustaining our natural resources and our ecosystems. We became frontliners of urgent work because as LGBTQ community member, we know how it feels to be left out from the mainstream assistance. The priority needs for women and girls of all diversities during and post disasters. As focal point for the Women Builders Group, women of all diversities build 16 cyclone-proof houses, assisted a maritime village with their walking bridge, which was destroyed by Cyclone Winston. We renovate homes of survivors of violence, LGBT women living with chronic diseases, and also construction stairs to her bathroom and toilet. We continue to create structural and material change for women by women. So if we are saying we support gender and climate justice work, we should invest our money where our mouth is. It is not just about construction, it's about breaking barriers, women empowerment, tackling patriarchy, and pushing for gender equality. We may be the frontliners of this work, but there are always obstacles. Patriarchy and power decides how we move in this world. That's why we need everyone in this work. It's not an easy work, but it takes everyone. It takes you and me. It takes the whole community. It takes the whole social movements, and also it also involves the state. It's time to bridge the gaps between gender equality, between where you invest your work and funding, and also engaging women in your spaces. Because we are not giving up. For me personally, as a member of the Rainbow community, I'm not giving up. On my beautiful Fiji, on my beautiful Pacific Islanders and islands, and also on this planet, because we only got one. On that note, happy Pride Month, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks very much. There's just is there any more slides to show, or that's the end? I think we're nearly at the end. This is just some of the work in conferences, various work on the streets, mobilizing, making sure that women feel engaged. Thank you, Kado. So we're going to end that there. And thank you for ending on a note that is about the importance of of LGBTQI-led social movements, which is really why we're here today, is to say it's not about just calling for change. There is work that is already ongoing. And often the issue is that it's very hard for us to get into some of the development spaces. It's sometimes done in a tokenistic way, or sometimes we are not touching the systemic shifts that we require in order to really work on changes to gender and human rights and social, economic, and ecological justice. Scientists are now telling us that we have between 3 years and 5 years, and one I've just read a report which says 7 years, that we have to turn around this incredible set of ecocide that we as humans are bringing on ourselves. And I say we because the effects are the entire planet. Even though it might be the rich industrial countries that have the wrong policies, even though it might be them who are refused to do the work on loss and damage, we have people in this room who are part of those negotiations, who are fighting for us in the multilateral spaces. But also in this room, we have the people who are fighting with us at the local level. And it's incredibly important for us to be connecting and speaking and discussing. So in the chat, we still have maybe about 20 minutes, which is really great that we still have some time. And I'll invite people to either put up their hands that they want to say something either under the reactions bar. You can go to the reactions tab at the bottom of your screen for those of you who are not as comfortable with Zoom, and just show that you want to speak, just raise your hand. But also I just wanted to highlight from the chat, for instance, from Litiana, who's also part of Alliance for Future Generations and Ganga, who's a yoga teacher, a mother and an entrepreneur. And she talks about the work on bodily autonomy and empowerment of individuals through yoga, and the work that's required on psychosocial change at the individual as much as at the collective level. So thank you for that set of work that you do, Liti, for many years. And if anyone's interested in getting in touch with Liti, please do. I'm just cycling through. So if there's anything, Joshua, that we need to, we now have the expression of interest forms that are in the chat. So please use those as well. Diva has top 10 tips on grassroots social organizing, which is really important and useful. Amasai we have in from Utopia, who's been part of the movements here in the Pacific and now is also Pacifica organizing with transgender and LGBTQI people in the US. So thank you for being here, and maybe talk to us about some of those issues. How do you push the countries like the US, who there's a really small group of countries who are not pushing forward on loss and damage? We have 140 countries who are part of a coalition on loss and damage. So how do we push those very small group of countries forward? We have Siobhan who's here, who has a massive knowledge and experience on these issues. I'm just highlighting, is there anyone else? Any questions? Does anyone have any questions? A lot of kind of positive reinforcement in the chat. Happy Pride from everyone. Now I'm just going to look here and see if there's anyone who wants to raise hands. Joshua, can you see anyone? Maybe I'll get Joshua to talk a little bit about, at this point, about PICAN and their work on climate justice right now. Would that be okay, Joshua, if you can just take us through some of the work of PICAN? Thank you.
Sure, Nolene, I'd be happy to. And thanks everyone for joining us today for this session. So at PICAN, we're part of the Global Climate Action Network, and we help coordinate the work for our country nodes at Kiribati, Tuvalu, Solomon Islands, and Vanuatu. But really what we're on right now is a project that is funded for by the EU. And part of that project, part of the reason behind that project was us realizing that we really needed to help develop some strong policy concerns for the region, especially in regards to climate change as a problem. And so it was about figuring out how we can listen better to communities and get their reflections and reflect that in turn into the policy briefs that we're creating, but also ensuring that we're able to articulate those policy concerns and those policy demands at the higher global multilateral spaces. That was the first big reason. But the second big reason behind this project, as Nolene knows, was that we really wanted to hammer in the linkages between the work in gender justice here in the region and also in climate justice. And so as a result of that, we've been engaged in a number of different pieces of work. But one of the main outputs of that has been in the establishment of this working group, which is the Climate and Gender Justice Working Group. And it really consists of a number of different civil society organizations in the region who have come together in this space to really help think about the different ways that we can work together to hammer in those linkages between our work in gender justice and in climate justice. And we've established a number of different activities that we hope to put through for the rest of the year, of which this is one. We've been able to bring in some regional experts, and we hope to bring in some more. But also it's really been sort of like a community of practice in some ways, because it's a whole bunch of us just coming together and sharing about our work, the things that have worked for us and what hasn't, and some of our concerns, especially for this calendar year. What are those different spaces that we can influence and that we can sort of infiltrate, if that's the word. And I do also want to say that part of our focus at PICAN is really hammering in the idea that it's about climate justice and not about climate change. Although, of course, we use that term whenever we need to refer to the problem or the phenomenon of climate change. And the reason why we keep trying to push forward this idea of it being climate justice is because, and I think Nolene mentioned it in her framing, is that there really is that historical and current responsibility to this crisis that is the justice issue to it. It's recognizing the history of colonialism that has enveloped our region as well as other regions in the world, and the extractivism that is embedded in it, and how that in turn fueled the Industrial Revolution, which in turn has brought about this global crisis that we're all concerned. And so it's about saying, well, that's the historical part. There's also the current responsibility with current countries and companies who continue to sell fossil fuels, who continue to explore for coal, oil, and gas, and saying it's these ones that really should be taking charge of the issue because we are on the receiving end of that. We're the ones that are facing the greatest impacts of it as small island developing states in the Pacific, even though our contribution to it is negligible at best. And so we try to hammer in that justice focus, but also we try to bring in the idea that while we might all be experiencing climate change, the phenomenon, we don't all experience it in the same way. And Abdul had mentioned this really brilliant report, the Down by the River report. And it's really lovely because a lot of it just captures stories and first-hand accounts from people of diverse SOGIESC right after Tropical Cyclone Winston in 2016. And they talk about their experiences post-Cyclone Winston. And what it does is that it really helps you realize that while we all might be experiencing the phenomenon of climate change, our experiences of it are so diverse and so different. And it's really impacted by the different sets of identities that we carry, the privileges that we have, and the challenges that we have. And so, for instance, we might all be facing sea level rise. There might be a straight cis man facing sea level rise, along with maybe a lesbian woman. But it might be the lesbian woman that gets accused by a community for the reason why these changes are happening while the cis man doesn't. And so there's all these different sets of experiences that are so different across the border. And it's because of that that we try and bring in that justice issue and that intersectional lens. And I just want to close off by saying that this work in bringing together gender justice and climate justice, it's part of a global trend of, I think, civil society movements all around the world who are coming together and realizing that they need to focus on these different sets of issues as one, whether that's gender justice, climate justice, nuclear justice, economic justice, because there's a lot of value to be derived from focusing on them holistically. But also it's compounded by this other worrying trend, which we're seeing now especially, and that is the reversal and rollback in some of the rights that many activists before us have fought really hard and fought for really long to achieve. And what we're seeing now is that we're seeing women's rights being rolled back, not just in the United States, but in other parts of the world. And I think what's worrying about that is that it might be happening to one group, but there is the understanding behind it that it will slowly filter down, and it begins this chain reaction of affecting all other groups. So we're not, and we cannot afford to really be comfortable in our own spaces. It's the recognition that it's women's rights that are being rolled back now, but soon it might be the rights of people of diverse SOGIESC and so on and so forth. And it might be happening in just one country, but it could start a chain reaction that affects all of us in all other countries in the world. And so us coming together and saying, let's work on gender justice and climate justice and economic justice and all of these issues collectively is important and significant, because it's about us at the base of it recognizing that we really need to, now more than ever, put all of our collective efforts and energy together to hold up a strong front against this assault and constant threat on our rights that we fought really hard to achieve and to maintain. And so that's really sort of where we're at PICAN. That's really been our strong focus for this year and of course for the years to come. Thanks, Nolene. I'll stop talking now.
Thanks so much, Joshua. As always, really clear and coherent, and really again talking about both intersectionalities and interlinkage that we require in order to do this work. Just before I hand it over to Abdul, just a shout out to Ofa. Thank you, Tamani, for letting us know Ofa's in the room, and a climate change advocate in Northern Division in Fiji. So glad to have you with us, and maybe join the working group. Anybody here who's interested, just get in contact with Joshua or Langi or Dylan from PICAN, and we'd love to have a broader set of members in the working group. So thank you. I'll just hand over to Abdul. Thank you.
Thank you, Nolene. Thank you, guys. This has been such a wonderful conversation. I did really want to pick on something that somebody said in the chat. This is more like, can I ask if you could expand on it, because I really loved what was written. This was about being cautious when we say natural disaster and how is geopolitics, and you know the narrative behind what's in hazard, what's a risk, and therefore what's a disaster. And I asked this only because last year when we were doing work around developing and creating a manual for SOGIESC inclusion and SOGIESC mainstreaming in community-based disaster risk management, we realized that these are very important concepts to introduce to communities, because we see natural disasters, you know, just that, rain, flooding, etc. But to explain the concept that things might not go towards that point, because you can remove risk and hazards maybe, or you can do some sort of resilience around that area. So I just was wondering, I think it was sorry if I'm not pronouncing the name correctly, Siobhan McDonald. So I'm sorry if I'm putting you on. Siobhan, sorry,
yes,
my bad.
I think, no, yeah. Abdul, it's fine. I think the only problem is that I think she's left the room. Are you still here, Siobhan, or have you left?
Yeah, I would
she's
like
actually
if maybe
part
someone
of
could,
many delegations. Yeah. Oh,
yes.
I'll get you in contact with her.
It would be...
and maybe, yes.
Sorry, Cloney, you go
Nolene.
first. It's the internet.
Yeah.
No, it's okay. It's a little bit hard because I think it's dropping out sometimes, Abdul. Just to say that she would be very open, I know, to having a conversation with you about this. And Sharon will probably take this forward as well. One of the issues that we talk about all the time is any time that you call something natural, what you're saying is it's, you know, you're removing the political part from the whole equation, which is because of those historical emissions, because of those changes that have been brought about in the social, in the economic, in the ecological, we can still call it a natural disaster, but really it's been constructed because of very bad social, economic, and ecological policies, and by those who have far too much wealth and power around the world. So it's that climate justice set of work that South delegations talk about very much. So Siobhan works very much with the Pacific delegations, and that's why she's raising that as an issue in multilateral spaces. So I'll get her email address to you and you can continue the conversation, but on to Sharon. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Nolene, and thanks, Abdul. Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important right now in the context of climate justice to be actually really talking about climate change induced disasters, because you're seeing it both at the national level, so the intensification of cyclones as one example, but also if you track climate information, we can also see how it is actually affecting access to water, which is connected to health and food security issues as well. So prolonged droughts, as well as what we had in the last cyclone season for this part of the Pacific was not so much the high number of category 5 kind of storms, but we did have these very intensive heavy rains with strong winds and very devastating flooding as well. So it is really important to be bridging that information, both in terms of climate information, so what's coming out of the IPCC reports, for example, and linking it with traditional knowledge as a way to look back and even talk as Pacific Island people, what were we experiencing previously and what are we experiencing now, and making those connections. Additionally, now, even in, coming out of the global platform for disaster risk reduction that just happened several weeks ago, is to also look at some of these global frameworks. So particularly the Sendai framework, where all our governments are supposed to be doing voluntary reporting to go into, a core set of recommendations that will, be discussed, deliberated in UN style next year, to actually also look at how the language is now expanding from in the context of disaster risk reduction, not only for what we were traditionally seeing during, in terms of disasters, but also looking at biological and other hazards as well. So this is also something that connects to even the humanitarian impact of nuclear testing in our Pacific region as well, because it is connected to the oceans. So maybe, the Climate Justice Working Group might actually want to have a conversation around how we actually make that connection with what is happening around the disaster risk reduction framework, those political spaces, to really make sure that we continue to drive that climate justice agenda. I hope that's helped clarify. Thanks.
Yeah, sorry, Nolene, if you'd allow me, I just wanted to just jump in at that point and say, well, what I was trying to say is, I realized as I read what was written in the chat, that when we were consulting for the SOGIESC and CBDRM manual, in the creation of it, the community members we consulted actually had that concept in their head, but the way it was, put in that development context, it wasn't in that manner. Now, as I look at that line in the chat, and I'm thinking of what conversation happened, the committee members themselves said that these things can be avoided. We went to Lomolomo village, the Turangani Koro of Lomolomo said, don't give us food packs. What you could do better is, can you go and ask government and tell them to make drains? Because because it's flatlands and there's no drainage, our farms and our land is getting flooded. And then of course they asked me, like, do you know anyone? So I just told them, okay, FCOS is the best place to go here. They can put you in contact with NDMO. But now that I think about it, communities actually realize this. We as people working in development space put it in development language, and I think we need to have that. We need to remove the disconnect that we have from the development language and the community's needs and wants, and really recognize and put that up there, that these people recognize the difference between risk, hazards, and resilience in their own context, rather than us trying to frame it in our development context. We just need to understand them better and take up their language into these spaces with NDMOs and government. Sorry, it was just a very powerful moment reading the sentence and then connecting it to the experience I had last day in the consultations.
Yep. Thank you, Abdul. And I mean, this is exactly the kinds of conversations, you know, that we want to make sure are taking place. Because the other thing that happens is it is about development language, but development language then goes into text, and text then goes into policy, and, you know, in law and in policy and in practice. And before you know it, you have responses that are not useful. And one of the things that feminists, including myself, are really interested in right now is, you know, often what I find is, and maybe this is where we start, you know, we're coming to the end of the session, but to give us something to walk away with, is what are those development practices that are about a misunderstanding of what the context and the conditions are in communities? Are those who have access to power using them in a way that further distances people from climate justice solutions? Because one of the things that, you know, which is a reason for the way that DIVA works, is we're interested in local led sets of work that arise from the bodies and the work and the ideas of people who are living through the issue. And if we're not doing that, then it becomes very hard for us to justify that we're listening to constituency. And Sharon and I and others have constant sets of work that we have to do, which are very, very difficult, which are about having those really deeply uncomfortable discussions with those who maybe you're working with closely as allies. You might not be in a room that you know you should be in. You might have community organizations who, because of vernacular, can't access those sets of work. But if you don't have that in your own system of work, then you won't realize that that's something that's missing. And it's those discussions that are the most powerful that autonomous local social organizing can do. So we're not having a go at each other, because that's horizontal hostility. What we're trying to do, all of us, is to try to find the best strategies, tactics and strategies. And I think we should continue to do that in these kinds of thinking spaces, in brave spaces where we can bring that up. So thank you, as always, Abdul. I'm gonna probably end in a couple of minutes. Sharon's just talking about CEDAW General Recommendation 37 has been put together by local-led movements around the world. As with many other general recommendations, there's nothing specifically on SOGIESC in there. I think there is a reference to women in all their diversity, but that doesn't help gender non-binary people, for instance. So it's about us also politically pushing the language whenever we can. I'm just looking, is there anyone else? If I may, my organization V-Pride, which is in Vanuatu, thank you, Malone, have actually developed a disaster management guide when addressing SOGI diverse individuals. I'm not sure if it's helpful, but I would be glad to provide this. Yes, please. And I think one of the first things that Jeshua will do is, if any of you are interested in having contact after this session, we're going to have many, many more webinars. We're really excited and interested to continue this. So please be engaged. Is there anything else? Just a lot of affirmation for the discussion. It's been really wonderful. I know it's a late day. Yes, please everyone share.
Nabriza.
Anything else, Joshua? Yep. Okay. What is that? Further up a little?
It's further up a little bit, yeah.
Oh, if there's time, yes. Thank you, Nabriza. My question is, how best can people like me who come from other island states but live closer to the Pacific than we do to our own homes, best serve, support, and be an ally to the work? Recognizing the importance of autonomous, local, feminist social movements, how best can we be involved in working towards shared values for reproductive gender, climate, sexual, and gender justice? Nabriza, is this about kind of ANZ within the region, Oceania movements? Is that what you're speaking about?
Yes, yeah. Hi, because I live in Melbourne, Australia, but I come from the Maldives. Yes. So then, you know, it's that intersection of trying to figure out how best to support. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think all of us as Pacific peoples, we can, and as small island peoples, we have various ways of negotiating power and you know, and our social movements. So I don't think any of us can speak for everyone, but the wonderful thing is the asking of that question, and to say things like, we've been really focused on trying to work between North and South ideas, between developed, non-developed. We don't like, a lot of us don't like that language anyway, because I don't think you can say what's developed and what's not when people are doing, you know, extreme damage to other people around the planet. So I think there is a mismatch in the terminology, but there's lots of ways that we categorize ourselves. And I think that as long as we're really clear and explicit on how we move in our place, and that we speak with respect for others, that is a really big help. And there are, for instance, some wonderful social movements in 350.org, for instance, ourselves who work with other feminists in Australia and New Zealand, who are trying to do that in a much better way, because there have been many imbalances in the past and things that maybe we don't talk about. And they are about extractivism, and they are about neocolonialism. And if at least we can speak about them, then we can start to excavate and come out with new kinds of relationships. So that's my contribution. Is there anyone else who'd like to also speak to that issue? It's a really important set of issues. Thanks, Amasai. Thank you, Amasai.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, I'll just be really quick. Hi, I'm Masai here from Seattle, Washington. Just really quick. So I work with Utopia Washington. And, you know, currently we have a program called Malama Ikaina, which is a care for our land. And that's the current work on climate, work on climate justice. But really, we are a community organization based here at Global North, and we're really working with the Native Americans here, who are the tribals of the land that we work on, and you know, really trying to work to find entry points in terms of engaging in policy and legislation. It's even harder to even work within the global north in terms of climate change, especially here in America. Very aggressive ways of, you know, working with the, because there's a lot of entry levels to work with within state, within different ways. There's so many levels of engagement, even within the state of Washington, to get policy recognized. And so we're working with the Native Americans here through our youth program, and also with elders who are LGBTQI folks. So happy to kind of really partner with anyone in the Pacific region. And Nolene, I know we've had this conversation through email, but you know, happy to kind of support or you know work together in partnership. Thank you.
Thank you. And there's Pacific people and small island people all around the world. So thank you, Nabrisa, for adding that into the discussion. And how do we do that when we need to be greater and bigger and deeper and stronger? We need to work out how to work all together, and not pretending it's a kumbaya moment always, but that there are real difficulties around power and oppression, and we try and work out what's a new way to work with each other. Thank you very much. I think on that note, we are going over time. If there's any last burning issues anyone wants to raise, otherwise it really has been wonderful to have this discussion. It's going to be recorded and online. So if there's anyone who missed today, there was about 80 people who were registered. So we want to get it up online and have everyone have access to it. So we're going to try and do another webinar or two before the end of the year. So let's see what we can organize, and please join us again and bring others. See one, bring one. So thank you, everyone. And I think I'll say goodbye on that note. Thank you from PICAN, from the Gender and Climate Justice Working Group, to everyone who's been part of this. We still have 26 people, and that's a wonderful thing on a late afternoon. So thank you wherever you are. Have a good day, have a good evening, and we'll see you later. Thanks, Joshua. Good night, everyone.